There is a strange silence that follows a fighter after the crowd stops chanting his name. For most people, the final bell means the fight is over. For a boxer like Fernando Vargas, it only means the noise moves somewhere deeper. It moves into the body, into the memory, into the way a man looks at old footage and realizes that every roar, every punch, every headline, and every brutal night under the lights has left something behind. At 47, Fernando Vargas was no longer the young storm the boxing world once called El Feroz. He was no longer the fearless kid rushing toward legends as if pain was just another step on the road to greatness. But when he finally began speaking openly about where his life had gone, what his name had cost, and why he could never truly walk away from boxing, it confirmed what many fans had suspected for years. Fernando Vargas did not simply retire from the ring. He carried the ring with him. To understand why that matters, you have to go back to the beginning, before the big arenas, before the championship belts, before the wars that changed him. Fernando Vargas was not built slowly in the public eye. He exploded into boxing like someone who had already been fighting his whole life before the cameras found him. Born in California, raised with the hunger and tension that often shape fighters long before they ever sign a contract, Vargas had the kind of intensity that could not be taught in a gym. Coaches could sharpen him, trainers could condition him, promoters could package him. But the fire was already there. That was what made people believe in him so quickly. He fought like a man who was trying to escape something behind him and destroy whatever stood in front of him at the same time. By the time he entered the professional ranks, Vargas carried more than talent. He carried expectation. In boxing, that is sometimes more dangerous than any opponent. A young prospect can be protected, polished, and guided carefully, but Vargas was pushed toward the biggest moments with astonishing speed. He was not treated like a normal rising fighter. He was treated like a future superstar who had to prove it immediately. And for a while, he did. He was young, aggressive, explosive, and fearless, in a way that made fans fall in love with him. Every punch seemed personal. Every stare down felt real. Every fight had the feeling that Vargas was not just trying to win. He was trying to make the world admit he belonged. That is what made his rise so captivating, but also what made it dangerous. Fernando Vargas became a world champion at an age when most fighters are still learning how to survive under pressure. He did not ease into greatness. He was thrown into it. And when a young fighter reaches the top that fast, the public often forgets that he is still human. They see the belt, the muscles, the confidence, the nickname, the knockout power, and they assume the person underneath can handle anything. But boxing has a cruel way of demanding payment later. The sport gives applause first, then sends the bill years afterward. The fights that made Vargas famous were also the fights that took pieces of him. He shared the ring with elite names, men who were not just opponents but historical forces in the sport. Félix Trinidad, Oscar De La Hoya, Shane Mosley, Ricardo Mayorga. These were not ordinary nights. These were violent chapters, each one loaded with pressure, pride, money, legacy, and expectation. Vargas did not fight carefully in those moments. He fought with the same emotional engine that had made him beloved. He came forward. He answered fire with fire. He absorbed punishment and returned it. To fans, that made him unforgettable. To his body, it created a debt that could not be ignored forever. And this is where the story becomes more complicated than a simple rise and fall tale. Because Fernando Vargas was never just beaten by losses. He was marked by the way people reacted to those losses. Boxing fans can be loyal, but they can also be merciless. They celebrate a fighter's courage until that courage starts to break him. They call him a warrior when he takes punishment, then question what happened to him when the damage begins to show. Vargas lived through that contradiction. He gave the public the kind of fights they claimed to want, and then had to live with the consequences when the public moved on to the next young star. For years, people watched him and wondered what was really going on behind the scenes. They saw the physical changes. They saw the emotional weight. They saw the way his name still carried power, but also history, pain, and unfinished business. Some wondered if he regretted taking such hard fights so young. Some wondered if he felt betrayed by the sport that had praised his bravery while demanding more and more from him. Some wondered if the old Fernando Vargas was still inside him, waiting for one more chance to prove that El Feroz had never disappeared. But the truth was deeper than that. Vargas was not chasing a comeback in the way people imagined. He was chasing meaning. After the lights dimmed and the championship years became memory, his life began to shift towards something more personal: his family, his sons, and the continuation of the Vargas name. That is where the story takes on a different emotional weight. Because when Fernando Vargas stands near the ring today, watching his sons fight, he is not just a former champion giving advice. He is a man staring at the same dangerous dream that once consumed him. He knows what the crowd sounds like when it loves you. He also knows what it sounds like when it turns. He knows how heavy a famous last name can become when the world expects greatness before a young fighter has even had time to become himself. And that may be the thing he finally revealed without needing to say it in one dramatic confession. The suspicion was true. Fernando Vargas never escaped boxing, because boxing became part of his family's bloodline. The sport that built him, broke him, celebrated him, criticized him, and followed him into middle age is now wrapped around the next generation. For fans, that sounds like legacy. For a father, it is more frightening. Legacy is beautiful when people applaud it from a distance. Up close, it is pressure. It is fear. It is watching your child walk toward the same fire that once burned you, and pretending your voice is calm while your heart already knows how hot those flames can get. That is why the Fernando Vargas story still matters. Not because of one secret, not because of one shocking confession, but because his life shows what happens when a fighter gives everything too early, becomes a symbol too quickly, and then spends the rest of his life trying to turn pain into purpose. At 47, Fernando Vargas was no longer fighting for belts. He was fighting for understanding, for respect for his sons, and maybe for peace with the young man he used to be. The world remembers El Feroz as the warrior who never backed down. But the man standing outside the ropes now reveals something much more human. Sometimes the hardest fight begins only after the final bell. What made Fernando Vargas so different was not just that he fought hard. Plenty of fighters are brave. Plenty of fighters are aggressive. Plenty of fighters know how to walk through punishment when the lights are bright and the crowd is screaming. But Vargas fought as if every round was a statement about who he was, where he came from, and why nobody had the right to underestimate him. That was his gift, and in some ways that was his curse. Because when a fighter builds his identity around never backing down, the sport eventually gives him situations where backing down might have saved him. Vargas rarely chose that path. He chose pride. He chose fire. He chose to meet danger directly, even when danger was standing across from him in the form of some of the most dangerous men of his generation. By the time Fernando Vargas reached the biggest stages, he was already carrying the weight of a man much older than his years. The boxing world looked at him and saw youth, power, confidence, charisma, and marketability. But beneath that image was a young man being asked to grow up in public while fighting men who could change a career in one night. That is the part many fans forget. They remember the entrance music, the stare-downs, the belts, the pay-per-view posters, and the highlight reels. They remember the punches. They remember the knockdowns. But they often forget the age. They forget how young Vargas was when he was thrown into fights that most fighters would spend years preparing for. They forget that confidence does not always mean readiness, and courage does not always mean protection. The fight with Félix Trinidad became one of those nights that followed him forever. For fans, it was drama. For boxing history, it was a classic war. For Vargas, it was something more personal and more painful. He was not simply trying to win a fight. He was trying to prove that he belonged among the most feared fighters in the world. And in that ring, under that pressure, he showed the kind of courage that made people respect him even when the night became brutal. He was hurt, dropped, tested, and dragged into deep waters. But he kept coming. That is what people loved about him. That is also what made the fight so costly. Because sometimes the same moment that earns a fighter eternal respect also takes something from him that no one in the arena can see. That became the pattern. Vargas did not have an ordinary career. He had a career made of high-risk collisions. Oscar De La Hoya was not just another opponent. He was a superstar, a polished, iconic figure with speed, intelligence, and the full glare of the boxing world around him. When Vargas fought him, it was more than a championship-level contest. It felt like a clash of identities. De La Hoya represented fame, crossover appeal, and golden boy perfection. Vargas represented rage, pride, hunger, and the refusal to be treated like a secondary character in anyone else's story. The build-up had tension, the fight had emotion, and when it ended, it left Vargas with another chapter that people would replay for years, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with criticism, but rarely with full understanding of what it meant to the man who lived it. The losses were not just numbers on a record, they were public events. That is what makes boxing especially cruel. In other sports, a loss can be absorbed by a team, a coach, a system, a season. In boxing, defeat belongs to one body and one face. The camera finds you. The crowd studies you. Commentators explain what happened while you are still trying to understand it yourself. Your pain becomes analysis. Your exhaustion becomes debate. Your vulnerability becomes content. Fernando Vargas had to live through that more than once. He did not just lose fights. He lost parts of himself in front of millions of people, and then had to answer questions about it, as though wounds could be explained neatly into a microphone. And yet, what people suspected about Vargas was not that he was weak. It was the opposite. They suspected he had been too strong for too long, too proud, too willing, too ready to give the public a war, even when a smarter, colder version of himself might have chosen survival. Boxing rewards that kind of spirit. While it is useful, it sells tickets, it builds legends. It creates emotional memories that fans carry for decades. But the sport does not always stay around to help a fighter process the aftermath. When the body changes, when the reactions slow, when the crowd quiets, when the phone stops ringing the same way, the fighter is left alone with the bill. That is why the second act of Fernando Vargas's life feels so revealing. He did not become a man trying to erase his past. He became a man trying to organize it, explain it, and hand parts of it to his children without handing them all of the pain. That is an almost impossible task. How does a former champion teach his sons to be fearless without teaching them to be reckless? How does he encourage ambition without allowing the family name to become a burden? How does he stand in the corner and give instructions when somewhere inside him, every punch they take might echo like a punch from his own past? This is where Vargas becomes more than a retired boxer. He becomes a father trapped between pride and fear. When his sons step into the ring, people do not see only young fighters. They see the Vargas name, they compare, they judge. They ask whether they have the same fire, the same toughness, the same violent charisma that made their father famous. That kind of attention can be a gift, but it can also become a cage. Fernando knows that better than anyone. He knows what happens when the world decides what you are supposed to become before you have fully become yourself. He knows how applause can sound like love, but also like pressure. He knows how a crowd can lift a young man and slowly push him toward danger at the same time. So when Vargas defends his sons, when he speaks with emotion, when he pushes back against critics, it is not just a famous father being sensitive. It is a man recognizing the machine. He has seen how quickly boxing fans can turn curiosity into judgment. He has seen how people who never took a punch can speak with absolute certainty about the heart of someone who has. He knows the cruelty of online criticism, the casual disrespect, the way strangers reduce years of sacrifice into one insulting sentence. And because he has lived it, he cannot simply stand by quietly while his children face the same storm. That is what gives the current Fernando Vargas story its power. He is not asking the world to forget what happened to him. He is asking people to see the full picture. The champion, the warrior, the losses, the pain, the father, the trainer, the protector, the man still trying to make peace with the sport that made him famous. For years, fans suspected there was more behind his intensity than simple aggression. They were right. Behind the fury was pressure. Behind the confidence was vulnerability. Behind the nickname El Feroz was a young man who gave everything he had because he believed that was the only way to be respected. And now, years later, the image is different, but the emotion is the same. Fernando Vargas stands outside the ropes, older, heavier with experience, watching the next generation carry his name forward. The punches are no longer landing on him, but somehow he still feels them. The crowd is no longer chanting for him in the same way, but somehow he still hears it. The final bell of his own career rang long ago, but the fight never completely ended. It simply changed corners. The hardest thing for a former fighter is not always retirement itself. It is learning how to exist when the world no longer measures you by what you can destroy. For years, Fernando Vargas had been understood through violence, through speed, through pressure, through the brutal honesty of two men standing across from each other with nowhere to hide. In the ring, everything had a purpose. Pain had a purpose. Fear had a purpose. Anger had a purpose. Even humiliation had a purpose, because it could be turned into fuel. But life after boxing is different. There is no bell to separate the rounds. There is no referee to step in when the damage becomes too much. There is no crowd to tell you whether you are winning or losing. A fighter has to wake up in ordinary silence and decide who he is without the thing that made him famous. That is the part of Fernando Vargas's story that people often overlook. They remember the great fights because great fights are easy to replay. They remember the face-offs, the knockdowns, the tension, the rivalries, and the violent pride that made him unforgettable. But what happens after the highlight reel ends? What happens when the same fighter who once walked into arenas as a feared champion must now live as a man with memories that do not always feel like victories? For Vargas, the answer was never simple. He had built his name on intensity, and intensity does not disappear just because a career ends. It has to go somewhere. For some fighters, it becomes bitterness. For some, it becomes isolation. For others, it becomes a desperate attempt to chase one more moment under the lights. For Vargas, it slowly became something more complicated, a mission to protect the name he had created, while trying to prevent that same name from crushing the people he loved. That is why his role as a father carries so much emotional weight. When Fernando Vargas looks at his sons, he does not simply see young athletes. He sees possibility, danger, pride, pressure, and echoes of his own past. He knows what it feels like to be praised before you are fully formed. He knows what it feels like when people decide you are supposed to be great, then punish you when greatness becomes difficult. He knows the seductive power of applause. He also knows the cost of believing that applause means love. That knowledge makes him proud, but it also makes him cautious. Because no matter how much a father wants his children to succeed, no father wants to watch them suffer the exact wounds that taught him his own lessons. The public, however, rarely understands that tension. Fans see the Vargas sons and immediately compare them to their father. They ask whether they have the same fire, the same power, the same toughness, the same aura. It is natural, but it is also unfair. A famous boxing name can open doors, but it also invites judgment before the first real chapter has even been written. Every performance becomes a referendum on the family. Every mistake becomes a headline. Every criticism feels personal, because it is no longer only about technique or record. It becomes about bloodline. It becomes about legacy. And legacy from the outside sounds glamorous. From the inside, it can feel like a weight strapped to your back before you have learned how to stand. Fernando Vargas understands that, because he lived under a different version of the same pressure. He was not the son of a famous champion, but he was the young fighter people expected to become one. That expectation can be intoxicating. It makes a man feel chosen. It makes every sacrifice seem meaningful. But it can also trap him inside an image. Vargas became El Feroz, the ferocious one, and that identity followed him everywhere. The public loved him because he was fearless, so fear became something he could not easily show. The public loved him because he fought with rage, so calmness could look like weakness. The public loved him because he never backed down, so even strategic patience could feel like betrayal. Once a fighter becomes a symbol, he is no longer completely free to be human. That is the hidden tragedy inside many boxing careers. The same qualities that make a fighter marketable can make him vulnerable. Promoters love courage. Networks love conflict. Fans love warriors. But a warrior still has a body. A warrior still has a family. A warrior still has nights when he wonders whether the applause was worth the damage. Vargas gave boxing what boxing demanded from him. He gave it emotion. He gave it risk. He gave it violent theater. He gave it the kind of fights that people talk about years later. But the more he gave, the more the sport seemed to ask for. And when he could no longer give in the same way, the conversation around him changed. That change is one of the loneliest experiences in sports. A champion is celebrated for being special, then criticized for becoming human. People who once praised his bravery begin to analyze his decline. They ask what went wrong, as if the answer is not visible in the very battles they enjoyed. They talk about timing, training, discipline, decisions, matchups, and mistakes. Some of that analysis may be fair, but it rarely captures the emotional truth. The truth is that Fernando Vargas was a young man who fought enormous fights at enormous cost. He won respect, but respect did not protect him from pain. He earned money, fame, and legacy, but none of those things could return the years when he had to learn lessons in front of the world. And that is why the phrase finally reveals what we all suspected works, not because it points to some cheap secret, but because it points to a deeper truth. People suspected that behind Fernando Vargas's toughness was a man still carrying the impact of everything he survived. They suspected that his passion for his sons was not just ambition, but protection. They suspected that every time he speaks about boxing, there is love in his voice, but also warning. He knows the sport can change a life. He also knows it can take more than people realize. So the story of Fernando Vargas at this stage is not about a fallen fighter trying to stay relevant. It is about a man trying to translate pain into wisdom. He cannot undo the wars. He cannot rewrite the nights that changed him. He cannot stop the world from comparing his sons to the legend of El Feroz. But he can stand close. He can speak from experience. He can remind them that being brave does not mean being reckless. And being a Vargas does not mean sacrificing your soul for applause. That may be the most important fight of his life now. Not winning another belt, but helping the next generation survive the dream that once nearly consumed him. There is a moment in every fighter's life when the opponent is no longer standing across the ring. The opponent becomes memory. It becomes regret. It becomes the version of yourself that still believes you could have done something differently if you had known then what you know now. For Fernando Vargas, that opponent may be the most complicated one of all, because his past is not filled with ordinary mistakes. His past is filled with nights that made him famous. The same fights that damaged him are the fights that built his legend. The same wars that fans still praise are the wars that forced him to carry pain into the years after the lights went out. That is what makes his story so difficult to judge from the outside. How do you separate triumph from trauma when they happened in the same ring? For many fans, Fernando Vargas will always be remembered as the young warrior who dared to stand in front of legends. That image is powerful, but it is also incomplete. It freezes him in time as if he were still that explosive fighter with fire in his eyes and rage in his punches. But the real man had to keep living after that image was created. He had to age. He had to change. He had to watch younger fighters enter the sport with the same hunger he once had, while knowing exactly how dangerous that hunger can become. He had to hear his name discussed in boxing conversations, not only with admiration, but with questions about what might have been. What if he had been moved more slowly? What if he had taken fewer wars early? What if his body had been protected longer? What if the sport had loved him less loudly, but cared for him more carefully? Those questions do not have clean answers. Boxing rarely gives clean answers. It gives moments, it gives images. It gives victories and losses, then leaves people to argue about meaning later. Vargas's career is full of those moments. He was great enough to matter, brave enough to be remembered, and vulnerable enough to become a cautionary tale. That combination is why his name still carries emotional weight. He was not a champion who disappeared because people stopped caring. He was a champion whose story stayed alive, because people felt something unfinished in it. They saw a fighter who had given too much too soon, and even if they did not say it clearly, many suspected the truth. Fernando Vargas had paid a price that was bigger than any record could show. That price was not only physical, it was emotional, it was psychological. It was the pressure of becoming a symbol, before having the time to become a fully protected man. When you are young and people call you fearless, you start believing fear is something you must hide. When they call you ferocious, you start believing calmness is not allowed. When they cheer every exchange, you start thinking survival is less honorable than suffering. That is the dangerous contract between a fighter and the public. The crowd gives love, but sometimes that love rewards the very behavior that hurts the fighter most. Vargas understood this contract because he lived it. He became beloved for his willingness to go into fire, and then had to live with the burns. In retirement, that realization becomes heavier. A fighter can convince himself during his career that everything is part of the journey. The pain, the criticism, the sacrifices, the loneliness, the brutal training, the punishments taken in the ring, all of it can be justified by the next fight, the next payday, the next title, the next chance to prove something. But when there is no next fight, the mind begins to revisit things differently. The body remembers what the ego once ignored. The heart asks questions the champion never had time to ask. And for someone like Fernando Vargas, those questions are not abstract. They are tied to his sons, because now he is watching the sport from the other side of the ropes. That may be the deepest twist in his story. The man who once walked into danger must now watch his children walk toward it. And no matter how confident he appears, no matter how proudly he carries the Vargas name, there must be a part of him that understands the terror of that position. When he was fighting, he could control his own choices, or at least believe he could. He could decide to press forward. He could decide to answer a punch with another punch. He could decide that pain was worth it. But as a father, he cannot climb into the ring and take every shot for his sons. He can train them. He can advise them. He can protect them from certain mistakes. But once the bell rings, they must face the truth of boxing alone. That is why every public criticism of his sons hits a nerve. To outsiders, criticism may look like part of the sport. Fans talk, commentators judge, social media reacts. But to Fernando Vargas, it is not just noise. It is the beginning of a familiar machine. He knows how quickly people can build a young fighter up and then try to tear him down. He knows how strangers can speak with cruelty, because they do not have to live with the consequences of their words. He knows how a boxer's confidence can be shaped, tested, and sometimes damaged by voices that have never understood the sacrifice behind a single round. So when he pushes back, it is not merely pride, it is recognition. He sees the storm coming because he has already stood inside it. But there is also hope in this part of the story. Because Fernando Vargas is not only repeating the past, he is trying to revise it. His sons are not walking into boxing without guidance. They have a father who knows the traps, the temptations, the false promises, and the emotional cost of chasing greatness too quickly. He knows that talent is not enough. He knows that fame can distort a young man's sense of self. He knows that winning can be dangerous if it convinces you that you are invincible. And perhaps most importantly, he knows that a fighter has to be more than his nickname, more than his record, more than the version of him that fans demand. That is what Fernando Vargas seems to be fighting for now. Not a comeback, not a headline, not one last attempt to prove he was as great as people once thought he could be. He is fighting to make the past useful. He is fighting to turn hard lessons into protection. He is fighting to make sure the Vargas name represents more than violence and pressure. Because legacy is not just about what a man did when the world was watching. Legacy is also about what he teaches when the cheering stops. And for Fernando Vargas, the final truth may be this. The ring took a lot from him, but it did not take his ability to guide, to protect, and to turn pain into purpose. There is something almost cruel about the way boxing remembers its fighters. It remembers them at their most violent, their most emotional, their most exposed. It remembers the punch that changed the fight, the knockdown that shook the arena, the stare after the bell, the blood on the trunks, the roar of a crowd that wanted more even when the fighter had already given too much. Fernando Vargas knows this better than most. His name is not remembered quietly. It carries noise. It carries conflict. It carries the image of a young man who entered the ring as if hesitation itself was an insult. But the older Vargas becomes, the clearer the real story gets. The most important part of his life may not be the nights when he fought legends. It may be what he has done with those nights afterward. For years, the public looked at Fernando Vargas through the language of boxing. Champion, contender, warrior, rival, underdog, veteran, fallen star. Those words are powerful, but they are also incomplete. They describe what he did, not what he carried. They describe the spectacle, not the aftermath. A fighter can be called brave by millions and still feel alone when the arena empties. He can be praised for taking punishment and still wonder, years later, why so many people were entertained by his suffering. He can be remembered as fearless even if fear was always there, hidden beneath discipline, pride, anger, and survival. That is why Vargas's story keeps pulling people back. It is not just a boxing story. It is a story about what happens when a man becomes famous for refusing to protect himself. And that is where the suspicion around Fernando Vargas becomes painfully human. Fans may have suspected that he had regrets. They may have suspected that he looked back on certain fights and wondered whether things could have been different. They may have suspected that behind the tough voice and public confidence, there was a man who understood the cost of the choices made for him and by him. But regret in boxing is complicated. It does not mean weakness. It does not mean a fighter wishes he had been less courageous. Sometimes regret simply means wisdom arrived after the damage had already been done. Sometimes it means a man can be proud of what he survived, while still admitting that survival took too much from him. That kind of honesty is hard for fighters because boxing rarely rewards vulnerability. The sport teaches men to hide pain, hide doubt, hide fear, and hide uncertainty. It teaches them to answer questions with confidence, even when their bodies are screaming. It teaches them to sell fights, protect their image, and never give an opponent psychological advantage. But life after boxing requires a different kind of courage. It asks a man to tell the truth without gloves on. It asks him to look at his past not as a highlight reel, but as a full human record. Fernando Vargas, in this later chapter of his life, seems to represent that difficult transition. He is still proud. He is still intense. He is still protective of the name he built. But he also seems more aware than ever that the old way of measuring greatness was never enough. That awareness matters most when it comes to his sons. Because the Vargas name is no longer only history. It is inheritance. Every time one of his sons steps into the ring, the past steps in with him. The commentators mention the father. The fans remember the wars. The critics compare styles, power, attitude, confidence, and potential. That kind of attention can motivate a young fighter, but it can also distort his path. It can make him feel as if he is not only fighting his opponent, but also fighting a ghost. The ghost of Feroz, the ghost of expectations, the ghost of a career that was both glorious and painful. Fernando Vargas knows that ghost intimately, and perhaps that is why he watches so closely. A father in boxing has to live with a contradiction. He wants his sons to be strong, but he does not want the sport to harden them beyond recognition. He wants them to chase greatness, but he does not want greatness to become a trap. He wants them to be respected, but he knows respect in boxing is often earned through suffering. That is a brutal equation for any parent. For Fernando Vargas, it is even more personal because he is not guessing what the sport can do. He has lived it. He knows how quickly confidence can become pressure. He knows how quickly pressure can become identity. He knows how quickly identity can become a cage. This is why his current chapter feels more emotional than a simple comeback narrative ever could. Vargas is not trying to relive his youth through his children. At least, the deeper truth seems more complex than that. He is trying to stand between them and the parts of the boxing world that nearly consumed him. He cannot block every punch. He cannot silence every critic. He cannot erase every comparison. But he can give them what he did not always have enough of: perspective. He can teach them that toughness is not the same as recklessness. He can teach them that a fighter does not have to accept every war just because the public demands one. He can teach them that being feared is not as important as being whole. And maybe that is what Fernando Vargas finally reveals most clearly at this age. The warrior was always a father waiting to emerge. The fury, the pride, the refusal to bow, all of it once belonged to the fighter. Now much of it belongs to the protector. When he speaks against critics, when he stands by his sons, when he carries himself like a man who still remembers every insult and every sacrifice, he is not simply defending a brand. He is defending a family. He is defending the idea that the Vargas name should not be reduced to old footage and painful comparisons. It should be allowed to grow, change, and become something larger than the violence that first made it famous. That is the kind of revelation that does not need a scandal to be powerful. It is quieter, but it cuts deeper. Fernando Vargas spent his youth proving he could take punishment. Now he is spending his later years proving that pain can become guidance. He once fought to be seen. Now he fights to make sure his sons are seen clearly, not just as extensions of him, not just as heirs to a famous name, but as young men trying to build their own truth in a sport that rarely gives anyone an easy road. And in that transformation, Fernando Vargas becomes more than the former champion fans remember. He becomes a reminder that sometimes the most ferocious men are not the ones still throwing punches, but the ones standing outside the ropes, trying to protect the next generation from the fire they know too well. What makes Fernando Vargas's later chapters so compelling is that he is no longer trying to win the same argument he fought in his youth. Back then, everything was about proving. Proving he belonged. Proving he was tough enough. Proving he could stand with the biggest names in the sport. Proving that the fire people saw in him was real. But time changes the questions a man asks himself. A young fighter asks, "Can I beat them?" An older fighter asks, "What did it cost me to try?" And somewhere between those two questions lives the real Fernando Vargas story. Not the version reduced to posters and highlights, but the version shaped by memory, fatherhood, pride, and the painful knowledge that greatness often arrives with a bill no one reads carefully enough at the beginning. For Vargas, the past is impossible to escape because the past still walks beside him. It follows him when fans bring up the old wars. It follows him when commentators describe him as fearless. It follows him every time one of his sons enters a ring, and the family name becomes part of the conversation before the first punch is even thrown. That is the strange burden of legacy. It keeps a man alive in public memory, but it also refuses to let him become completely new. No matter how much Fernando grows, no matter how much he changes, a part of the world still wants him frozen as El Feroz, the wild young champion who charged forward with anger in his eyes and danger in both hands. But the man standing there now is not only that fighter. He is the survivor of that fighter. And survival is not always glamorous. People often speak about surviving as if it is a clean victory, but survival can be messy. It can mean carrying pride and pain in the same breath. It can mean loving the sport that hurt you, because the sport also gave you a name, a purpose, and a life your younger self could only dream about. It can mean defending boxing in one moment and warning your children about it in the next. That contradiction does not make Vargas confused. It makes him honest. Only someone who has truly lived inside boxing can understand how a sport can save and damage a person at the same time. That is why his presence in his sons' careers feels so emotionally charged. He is not watching from a distance like a casual parent, proud of athletic achievement. He is watching as a man who knows the exact sound of danger. He knows what a clean punch sounds like when it lands. He knows what false confidence looks like before a hard lesson. He knows how a young fighter can mistake applause for destiny. He knows how promoters, fans, and critics can all pull a boxer in different directions until the fighter forgets which voice is his own. So when he stands near the ring, his eyes are not only the eyes of a father. They are the eyes of a man reading the future through the scars of the past. And that is where the emotional center of this story becomes clear. Fernando Vargas is trying to do something extremely difficult. He is trying to honor the road that made him while also protecting his sons from the worst parts of that same road. He cannot pretend boxing is harmless, because he knows better. But he also cannot pretend boxing is only tragedy, because that would erase the pride, discipline, identity, and opportunity it gave him. So he lives in the middle. He teaches, he warns, he pushes, he protects. He celebrates the victories, but he also understands the danger hidden behind victory. He knows that winning too early can be just as dangerous as losing too badly, because both can change the way a fighter sees himself. This is the kind of wisdom that only comes after the crowd leaves. During a career, everyone has advice. Trainers, promoters, managers, fans, journalists, family members, and rivals all have opinions. But after the career, when the noise fades, the fighter is left with a quieter education. He begins to understand which decisions were brave and which were unnecessary. He begins to understand which sacrifices were meaningful and which were demanded by people who never had to pay the price. He begins to understand that not every war is noble simply because the audience enjoyed it. Fernando Vargas's life now seems shaped by that education. He cannot change his record. He cannot erase the damage. But he can make the lesson visible. That visibility matters because young fighters often inherit only the glamorous parts of boxing stories. They see the belts, the money, the entrances, the interviews, the respect, the power of being feared. They do not always see the loneliness after defeat. They do not always see the emotional confusion of being praised for taking punishment. They do not always see how quickly the public can turn a human being into a symbol, then punish him for failing to remain that symbol forever. Vargas has seen all of that, and because he has seen it, his guidance carries a different weight. He is not speaking from theory. He is speaking from experience written into his body and memory. That may be why the phrase, "what we all suspected," cuts deeper than it first appears. What people suspected was not just that Fernando Vargas had hidden pain. Many fighters have hidden pain. What they suspected was that the pain had become part of his purpose. They suspected that the man who once fought with reckless fire had learned, over time, to turn that fire into something more protective. They suspected that behind the hard exterior was a father who understood fear more deeply than he could ever admit in his fighting prime. They suspected that the old warrior was still there, but no longer fighting for himself. And maybe that is the real transformation. Fernando Vargas once entered the ring to prove he could not be broken. Now, he stands beside the ring, trying to make sure the people he loves do not have to break themselves to be respected. That is not weakness. That is growth. That is the difference between a fighter who only knows how to attack and a man who has learned how to guard what matters. In his youth, Vargas gave boxing everything because he believed that was the path to greatness. In this later chapter, he seems to understand that greatness without peace is incomplete. So when people look at Fernando Vargas today and wonder what changed, the answer is simple but heavy. Everything changed except the fire. The fire is still there, but it has matured. It no longer burns only for belts, rivals, headlines, or revenge. It burns for family. It burns for legacy. It burns for the chance to take a painful past and turn it into a shield for the next generation. And in that sense, Fernando Vargas did reveal what people suspected all along. He was never just a fighter chasing glory. He was a man trying to survive the meaning of his own name. The final chapter of Fernando Vargas's story is not written in the language of defeat. It is written in the language of consequence. That is an important difference. Defeat suggests that something ended, that a man was reduced by what happened to him, that the losses and the hard nights became the whole story. But consequence is more honest. Consequence means every choice, every punch, every victory, every rivalry, every roar from the crowd, and every painful morning afterward became part of the man he is now. Fernando Vargas was not erased by boxing. He was shaped by it, scarred by it, educated by it, and forced to carry its lessons into a life that became bigger than the ring. For a long time, people looked at Vargas and saw only the fighter. They saw El Feroz, the young champion who fought with his chest forward and his pride exposed. They saw the man who refused to step away from danger, the fighter who seemed offended by the idea of backing up. the warrior who gave fans the kind of brutal entertainment they never forgot. But now, with distance, the picture becomes clearer. The fighter was only one layer. Beneath the aggression was a young man desperate to be respected. Beneath the confidence was pressure. Beneath the rage was fear of being dismissed. Beneath the fame was a human being trying to survive a sport that rewards sacrifice while rarely explaining the cost. That is why Fernando Vargas's life after boxing may be even more revealing than his career inside it. In the ring, he had a role everyone understood. He was supposed to fight. He was supposed to be hard. He was supposed to give the crowd what it came to see. But outside the ring, the role became less clear. A retired fighter has to rebuild himself without the simple structure of training camp, weigh-ins, opponents, and fight night. He has to discover whether the applause was attached to the man or only to the violence he could produce. He has to learn how to be remembered without becoming trapped by memory. For Vargas, that process has unfolded in public, through family, through reflection, and through the complicated responsibility of carrying a famous name into a new generation. And that is where the emotional truth of this story lands. Fernando Vargas did not finally reveal some cheap secret. He revealed something heavier, that a fighter can love boxing and still understand how much it took from him. He can be proud of his wars and still recognize that some of them came too early. He can defend his legacy and still know that legacy is not a simple blessing. He can encourage his sons to chase greatness and still fear the price greatness may demand. Those contradictions do not weaken his story. They make it real. Because real life is rarely clean enough to fit into one headline. Fernando Vargas is not only a champion, not only a cautionary tale, not only a father, not only a survivor. He is all of those things at once. For his sons, that may be the greatest gift he can offer. Not just training, not just connections, not just a famous last name. The real gift is perspective. He can tell them what the crowd will not. He can tell them that applause can be dangerous when it teaches a fighter to ignore pain. He can tell them that pride must be controlled before it becomes a trap. He can tell them that toughness is not proven by taking unnecessary punishment. He can tell them that a man does not have to destroy himself to be respected. And perhaps most importantly, he can tell them that being a Vargas means more than repeating his old image. It means learning from it. That is the transformation fans are witnessing now. The same fire that once pushed Fernando Vargas into violent exchanges is now being used to protect, guide, and defend his family. The same pride that once made him refuse retreat is now aimed at critics who judge his sons without understanding the burden they carry. The same intensity that once made him a dangerous opponent now makes him a fiercely present father. In his youth, that intensity was explosive. In this stage of life, it has become focused. It no longer exists only to win rounds. It exists to preserve something more fragile than a championship belt, the future of the people he loves. There is something deeply human about that. Many athletes spend their lives trying to outrun who they used to be. Vargas seems to be doing something different. He is not running from El Feroz. He is trying to understand him. He is trying to take the best parts of that young fighter, the courage, the hunger, the discipline, the refusal to be ignored, and separate them from the parts that caused pain. That is not easy. A man cannot simply cut his past into clean pieces. The glory and the damage are often tangled together. But growth begins when he stops pretending they are the same thing. So when people ask what Fernando Vargas finally revealed, the answer is not found in one interview, one quote, or one dramatic confession. It is found in the way he lives now. It is found in the way he watches his sons. It is found in the way he protects his family name. It is found in the way he carries old wounds without allowing them to become the only thing that defines him. He revealed that the fight never really ended, but it changed meaning. It moved from the center of the ring to the corner. It moved from personal glory to family legacy. It moved from proving toughness to teaching wisdom. And maybe that is why his story still hits so hard. Because Fernando Vargas represents something every great fighter eventually faces. The moment when the world remembers your battles, but you have to live with their aftermath. He gave boxing his youth, his body, his pride, and his fire. In return, boxing gave him fame, pain, purpose, and a name that still echoes. Now, at this stage of his life, he is trying to make that echo mean something better for the next generation. That is not a sad ending. It is a hard-earned one. Fernando Vargas may no longer be the young champion charging into war, but the warrior is still there. Only now he is fighting for peace.